Hello, everyone, and welcome Minister Catherine McKenna to our special Armchair session, following up on a series of great keynotes and fireside chats with several of your colleagues federally, provincially, and municipally across the country. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to kickstart, for those folks, we do have several folks joining us for internationally. I'm going to give a little bit of a background to you, Minister McKenna, because it's been such a, not only a delight working with your ministry, but also just a whirlwind tour in the last 5 years in terms of Canada transitioning itself into a nation dedicated to the low carbon mobility economy and the green economy. So in 2015, for folks who don't know, Minister McKenna was elected as the first female member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre, and then she was appointed as Minister of Environment and Climate Change, clearly indicating the mandate and the vision that the government had put forward for itself. I think without doubt, you've built a reputation as a skilled negotiator and community builder. I think we've all seen you in action on the front line on very difficult files. One of the successes that you've had that I think a lot of folks in our industry would be aware of is securing federal funding for the Ottawa LRT Phase 2. Of course, we in our audience are very familiar with the help your ministry provided in securing funding with Natural Resources Canada as well for our Pan-Canadian Electric Bus Project, which has now been deployed in Vancouver, Brampton, and York region, which is a world first on interoperable transit systems for electrification. And for those folks who aren't aware, internationally, in October 2019, Minister McKenna was re-elected in Ottawa and appointed to one of the most important portfolios in government, which is Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. And for our transit audience members, of course, that's a ministry that everybody is keenly aware of now, wondering whether economic stimulus funding is going to come in the form of green infrastructure dollars. So thank you very much, Minister McKenna, for taking the time. We know you're simply swamped, and we've already got a load of questions to go into. So I'll turn it to you for just preliminary comments if there's any context that you'd like to add, given the situation that we're in, and we're going to jump into some queries right away.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks for everyone for joining in. I came to this portfolio from as Minister of Environment and Climate Change previously. So clearly that lens is very strong in terms of my vision and our government's vision of what we want to do in infrastructure. Public transit, hugely important part of the investments that we're making in infrastructure across the board. And I think on the COVID piece, I mean, it's obviously a really challenging situation. Our government has been extremely focused on the immediate health and economic situation. We are thinking about if you're going to do stimulus spending, and even if you didn't have COVID, we need to move to a cleaner future, and that will require very significant investments in infrastructure by different orders of government, and we're certainly there and will continue to be there, but also by the private sector and other partners. And so I think there's huge opportunities. We need to show flexibility in the time of COVID. So we've looked at our programs and how can we be more flexible and really be supporting provinces and territories while moving ahead on a lot of projects. So we've approved a significant number of projects. We just had a great announcement this week with Waterloo, investments in public transit, but also linking that to active transportation, because I think that's important. You can't just look at public transit. How are people getting to the public transit? In Ottawa, I like to say 80% of Ottawans will live within 5 kilometers of LRT, but how are they getting those 5 kilometers? And so we want that to be as easy and as seamless as possible. And I just want to thank all the folks I've had a chance to work with. And the Brampton announcement was an example of how we can be world leading, thinking about, interoperability when we, when you in the infrastructure piece, very important on the electric bus side. So that was a great announcement. And it's also very tangible. And so that's the nice thing about my portfolio. These are real things. And I don't love the word infrastructure. So my title also is the Minister of Communities. And I think in the time of COVID, we're all very focused on communities. And I think really thinking about how do we build better communities, because it's not infrastructure. That's a bureaucratic word. It's cleaner water. It's better public transit. It's natural infrastructure. It's a whole range of things that are improving people's lives.
Mm-hmm. And on that, maybe I'll dive right into one of the burning questions that folks are wondering, and this overlays both transit agency concerns and city mayors. We've had a chance during this conference to talk to Mayor Bonnie Crombie in Mississauga and Mayor Patrick Brown, and we have Don Iveson coming up as well. And, across the board, as we all know, cities are running out of cash and they've got a big gaping hole, and transit is something that they don't want to roll back on, and they also want to still electrify it and go green. Yeah. So they've gone to their provinces, and their provinces are saying, look, we can't take out debt. Only the feds can take out debt. So they've gone to the feds, and it seems the buck is being passed all the way to the federal government, and everybody's looking to the federal government to basically save everything. Can you give us a little bit of insight into specifically electric mobility and transit dollars going forward? There's so much the federal government can do, and maybe you can highlight to us what the government is doing and about to do on that file. What would you like to see the provinces doing in order to help out and co-support that effort?
Well, first of all, I mean, we absolutely recognize the challenging situation for municipalities, in particular the loss of revenues from public transit, but there are other costs that have been incurred as a result of COVID. And so we did one thing, which is really, it was just to help with immediate fiscal crunch, which was to advance gas tax money. That is not everything, that is existing money, but giving it in a lump sum earlier has made a difference. I just saw in BC, one of the communities said like they're now going to be able to make the capital investments now that they have this money advanced. But we are working with provinces, and I think that's really important that we're working on a safe restart agreement. If we are going to be able to continue to support essential workers, but also get people to work, we need to be making sure that we're supporting public transit in a safe way. And in fact, you may need more public transit rather than less because we have to social distance too. So we're well aware of that, working with the provinces. And on the, we made a number of campaign commitments, including 5,000 electric buses. And don't worry, that is still a priority for our government. We haven't, because of COVID, as I say, we've been working on the immediate needs. But so we haven't had a regular budget, and we were focused, and I know working with you folks and others to make the case for investments in electric buses. So that's still a priority. We're making these announcements and investments right now. Guelph, many municipalities, we've made those investments with our existing program. But if we're going to hit 5,000 electric buses, that's a very large number. So we will need more federal money. But I'm also looking at, we have the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We have other partners that want to be part of it. How do we get the investments we need, including looking at the opportunities with the private sector? Because it's not just the buses, I've learned. It's charging infrastructure can be extremely expensive. And so we need to do this. And it's a real economic opportunity. And we're in terms of buses, I actually quite like that we're a world leader in electric buses with New Flyer, Nova Bus, and Lyon Bus. And so I think that's a real opportunity too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a little bit of brief period a couple months ago where, facing the loss of the fare revenues, we did hear in the transit sector some murmurs about, well, now it's time to go back to diesel, because it's cheaper and we can't afford electric mobility. That has disappeared, thankfully. I mean, that trend is just not there. Everybody is quite committed to staying on that pathway, and you can't just, fire and lay off all of your electric bus planning team because it takes a long time to ramp back up. Yeah. But as you said, it's a very, very challenging goal. If I can segue from that, we're going to come back to transit in a moment, but to your overall portfolio and your government's portfolio in terms of helping us to transition to the clean economy. There are a lot of dialogues out there, and we have questions coming in about the support of the government in the transition to the green economy more broadly. A little while ago, the government did announce support for cleaning up orphan oil wells. And yesterday, I made a speech at the opening of this conference about the fact that there will be households that are negatively affected by the transition to the green economy, and that we need to prepare for creating other jobs for them. Could you comment to us about the challenges ahead and what the government's aware of in terms of this transition to green and clean? People like me will be employed, but then there's going to be other people who are going to lose out. And based on your past experience as Minister of Environment, what are the challenges ahead for the government in buttressing that transition to the green economy more broadly?
So, look, the good news is there will be loads of jobs in the green economy. And I think we need to be very focused on that. And you've seen, you take some stats looking at the US, where you're seeing a trend getting out of coal. And that's just an economic piece. It's actually sometimes not even driven by decisions of governments. It's just the economics don't make sense. And there are many more jobs now in the renewable sector. So I think that's the good news, but it doesn't happen seamlessly. And I think that we need to be focused on exactly what you said. I got into politics because I want to help improve lives. and we can't have winners and losers. And so one thing that we did, which was, I think, leading in the world, we announced that we're phasing out coal, but we also at the same time created a just transition task force. And that was led by Hassan Youssef, one of our labor leaders, and with a number of folks. And he actually, his group, they went out, the task force went out to communities and listened to folks who literally, they would be packed auditoriums, 600 people, worried about, like, angry, worried, but committed to climate change, just trying to figure out how they're part of it. And so you need a lot of different things. They asked for supports for retraining, and I think that's critically important, that there are these other jobs, and you need the skill sets for them. You need investments in infrastructure. They talked about that they need other opportunities. And so what are the other opportunities? How do we invest in that? But look, I think that there is no doubt we have to move to a cleaner future, but it's also a competitive advantage for Canada. These are good, well-paying jobs. And so now the focus has to be, how are we ensuring that we're getting those jobs here in Canada? So getting back to looking at electric buses, that's a great opportunity there to make investments, but also create jobs here. And also making sure that we're training folks and they're getting the skills they need to transition in some cases. And the good news is with young people, I talk to them. I go to everything from the engineering classes to, the tech colleges, and the young people are getting it. They're focused on, they're really interested in jobs where there's a sustainability focus. So the good news, we have young people. We now need to just make sure that through the economy and also in different communities that we're providing those opportunities.
Yeah, and in my opening speech yesterday at the conference, I said currently we employ about 50,000 Canadians in transit. Why don't we employ 500,000 or 1 million? Like, we could grow mobility to that. Those are great jobs that people want. And that's a social issue, which segues into a question that we'd like to ask you about the prevailing social movements of the day. I've made no qualms about the fact that CUTRIC, we pursue gender equality, and we've talked about the movement around I do not consent, having common ground with the movement around I cannot breathe, and gender and racial inequalities being exacerbated and demonstrated to be what they are because of COVID-19 inequalities. Given that that's the context we're in, given that that's what we're facing, people are hurting, they're suffering, gender and racial equalities are being made very evident, as are the inequalities of access to healthcare. Yeah. Given all of that context, and given that your role is Minister of Communities, what would you say is really Canada's role and infrastructure's role, your ministry's role, in helping to overcome gender and racial inequalities through community building and transit systems development?
So, that's a really great question. So in our program, we do have a requirement for community benefit agreements. So I think those are really important, so that you're actually providing good local jobs, supporting local suppliers. But I've spent a lot of time recently, before, but more recently, given what's going on, talking to members of our Black Caucus, the broader community, and they want job opportunities. They want their businesses to be to have opportunities. And so I think we need to really be focused on that, because that is also how families are going to succeed. You're going to have, you need people to have jobs, and this is how diversity of businesses will succeed. But more broadly, so that's if a project is in a particular place, you can have a community benefit agreement, but you need to make sure you're at where you're building is prioritized. And I think that we need to do some reflections. Are we, building, so everyone has the same opportunity? So we have a community and rec center program. Are we making sure that communities across Canada are going to have good recreation and cultural community facilities, and have good access to good public transit? And so what we are now looking at is, it sounds kind of policy wonky. I am a policy wonk too, but I'm a very practical person. But social determinants of infrastructure, what does that mean? It means actually looking and making sure you get more value out of your infrastructure dollars, that you're not just building for the sake of building, that you're actually building to improve lives, to ensure that you tackle the infrastructure deficit in Indigenous communities, but also in some, other communities, that you look at a gender lens. We have a gender lens, but I think that just being really focused on how is the dollar, tax dollars are hard to come by. How do you make sure that those tax dollars are doing what they need to do in terms of building good infrastructure, but actually having the broader benefits where it comes to addressing inequalities broadly? And also the systemic discrimination, because there has been underinvestment in particular communities, and we really all have to be part of that. And so, as Minister of Infrastructure, something I take extremely seriously, and I think climate lens is also part of that. You need to think about how are you going to get the broader outcomes. And one other thing that I would say, and hopefully this is something that would be good news to you folks, I think we need to do a national infrastructure assessment. Really figure out what are our long-term infrastructure goals. I now have, we invest in buckets, we invest in public transit, we invest in green infrastructure, but that's not a goal, that's a bucket. It's not how many projects you do. Of course you want to do, more projects, or maybe you want better quality projects, but I think we also need to be thinking, we say net zero by 2050. You're not going to get that by chance. You're not going to get there by buckets. You're going to get there by hard work, looking at your outcomes of your infrastructure and having a long-term vision on infrastructure. Part of what we committed to, and one of the commitments we made in the campaign, was long-term predictable public transit funding. So $3 billion a year. We haven't had that. We have programs. And I think that's really important so that you can plan public transit, often very long-term projects. And I think having that certainty is very good for communities. It's also very good for the market if we want to bring in infrastructure investments. And a good example of how you can bring in the private sector is the REM project in Montreal. The Canada Infrastructure Bank was a partner in that. And so you're able to get more dollars, which is really important. So anyway, I think that having discipline and being very clear-headed about what you're trying to do and making sure every dollar really counts is going to be a major focus, but I think there are ways we can do even better.
Well, let's build on that, actually. We just finished the massive 2-year rail innovation study with your colleagues at Transport Canada. Mm-hmm. And they set out the goal of figuring out, if there were money in a bucket, what kind of rail innovation projects should we put it in? What came out of that national consultation was, look, what's the strategy? By 2030 or 2040, how do we want to be moving Canadians and freight? If we can set a target, then we design to that target, and that's what we fund, and there's no target. And so expanding that to electric transit and so on, right now, there is no strategy that says by 2030, by 2040, we want to be the world's leader in electric bus manufacturing with this many units in volume, or we want this many Canadians traveling on zero emissions transit, or we want this number of electrons supplying the fuel supply chain. So those targets aren't there. That would be a strategy, what you're referring to. Can you reflect a little bit about how much you feel we're moving towards strategic target setting for the industry, which would probably require some merging of the minds from natural resources, from infrastructure, from transport, and from industry? How far are we to building like transportation electrification strategy or rail strategy that then designs your buckets of funding?
Well, I mean, I think that as you've been part of a discussion. I think there's many discussions. I think we need to link these discussions and be very clear about, as you say, the outcomes. And so I think that a national infrastructure assessment where we provide more coherence in the long term is really needed, because it's national in the sense that we need all orders of government to be part of this and really believe in this longer term vision. It'll help with planning. It'll help, with being more mindful of dollars. It'll help, looking at how do we link Canadian jobs or Canadian businesses with this long-term goal. So I think very important. And I think this assessment is part of it. And we're already starting work on that, because that, I think as we look even at stimulus dollars, we need to be very focused on don't just spend money and don't just say you want to do things, like be very clear. How are you going to get the outcomes? And certainly on climate, I've realized that we had to develop a climate plan, and they were very clear. We knew what our target was. So there are measures within that plan. I mean, you need to get more detailed, and public transit is a part of it. But we have a number of different goals across government. Now we have to link it, and we have to link our infrastructure investment to it.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, building on that, then we've got some questions coming in from the audience about what are our targets or our goals in the future in terms of how much we create the jobs here in manufacturing some of these services and systems. You alluded to earlier in your comments that you're proud we have Nova Bus and New Flyer and footprints of ABB and Siemens, and we've got Ballard and we have Hydrogenics, and we have lots of players in this space, right? And as all transit agencies are going electric more or less, or setting out some zero emissions targets, there's a real opportunity not just to clean the air, but to employ a lot of people by attracting manufacturing to stay and grow here. To what extent then is the government looking at Canadian content rules, foreign direct investment rules that would say it's not enough that you eliminate the emission, you also have to create a job along the supply chain in Canada doing it in order to win these procurements or get this dollar from infrastructure?
I think that is really important. Obviously there's some international obligations we have, but other countries do it too. My background is actually a trade lawyer. I think that we need to be mindful that we want the jobs here. We want the expertise here. And that'll create international opportunities. Once again, it's about being mindful of the dollars we're spending. How do we ensure that those jobs the money we're spending actually translates into good jobs, supports good Canadian businesses, helps them grow, creates new opportunities. So that is certainly part of our reflection. And procurement, we spend a lot on procurement, right? And that's also who are we procuring from, I think is critically important. So those discussions are being had. You have to be mindful about how you design it. But I think we have to. It would be a completely missed opportunity. Take electric buses. We have the great manufacturers of buses here. We should really be leveraging that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there used to be a time, certainly in the early 2010s and 2000s, when you just couldn't question things around Canadian content because globalization had it that you just couldn't require those things. But if the NAFTA negotiations have taught us anything, everything's up for interpretation and variability. And if COVID's taught us anything, the need to have some domestic resilience is incredibly important in the manufacturing supply chain. The next question that's coming in is allied to that. So as we're going to this electrified world, whether hydrogen fuel cell or battery electric, we at CUTRIC and certainly our audience members recognize that there's transference of technology from the automotive sector into heavy duty and vice versa. And we know that in Ontario, we don't make electric cars right now, and the automotive sector is very important, but we do make parts. And there's large players like Magna and Linamar and other auto parts manufacturers that are involved in the heavy duty landscape. To what extent has there been dialogue between your ministry and the Ministry of Navdeep Bains around the traditional automotive innovation sector of propping up the auto sector and the convergence with infrastructure dollars that will benefit heavy duty manufacturers in this industry in Canada? And is there any plan ahead or thought ahead about trying to get the automotive and the heavy duty transit manufacturing industry starting to coordinate to synthesize jobs?
Look, I think that's really important. I'm from Hamilton, the Hammer. So certainly the auto sector, manufacturing is incredibly important. And I think that, there is huge opportunities with Minister Bain's portfolio at ISED and infrastructure working together on program design that creates those incentives and outcomes. And look, I think that we want to attract the investment here as well. I think there's a huge opportunity for a whole variety of reasons, including our immigration policies. They've been, when I go internationally, I have huge opportunity to talk to folks because it's not just Canadian companies. We want other companies to locate here as well. So I have very good conversations. And I think that especially right now, having progressive views on immigration and recognizing that we want talent, where some other countries are taking a very different approach, I think is an opportunity. But you're right, making sure that we're linking what we do as a government and also linking partners, as you say, on the heavy duty side, the auto side. And we also, sometimes I think how do I put this? I think that we still have ways to go for all businesses, companies to understand the opportunity of moving to a cleaner future. That the risk of not doing that for your own business is extremely significant. And so that we all need to be thinking about that and really looking at where the economy of the future is. I mean, it's not even the economy of the future. It's already here now that you've seen consumer preferences, you've seen government requirements, you've seen, that we're making this move to the cleaner future. And I certainly want Canadian businesses to be part of that. And that's why things like climate disclosure and really understanding what the risks are to your business, what the opportunities are in the cleaner future is going to be critically important. Because someone said internationally, they said that it's about whether you're going to future-proof your own business. And making sure you understand, what the future is going to look like. And public transit has changed so much. Even the automobile, you talk to young people, they don't want a car. I never heard about this. I was like, when I was 16, that was like I didn't get a car at all, but I got my driver's license, and I never imagined that I wouldn't, as an adult, have a car. But there's a whole shift in how young people look at things, and we need to be part of that. And they're demanding a cleaner future too, which is obviously great.
Mm-hmm. Well, I salute your car avoidance as a fellow non-car owner, or rather myself, a non-car owner. Now, having said that, you talk about future-proofing industries and recognizing that. Can we talk a little bit about future-proofing cities? Because the whole jurisdictional division in this great grand confederation of ours, as we're talking about with several mayors, really discombobulates cities in their fight against climate change. And in some ways, it disempowers them because they don't have the revenue-generating tools they need to be the leaders in climate change. So can we reflect a little bit? Can you share your thoughts about the role of big city mayors in fighting climate change and in bringing transit back post-COVID? And then the challenges you're aware of, which is they can't just create a new tax and create new revenue tools. And often they've been rebuffed when they've tried to do things like road pricing and tolling roads to create some of those new revenues. So we all are relying on cities and city mayors to get transit going, to save the economy, to save the country from pollution and climate change. But they actually just don't have the financial tools available to them to do so. Is it time for a large constitutional discussion in Canada about how we treat cities? Not to give you a weighty.
You're channeling John Iverson right now.
It's like in the most positive possible way. But is it time for a larger discussion about the place of cities in transit and revenue generation and climate action?
So, I mean, look, I think we all kind of lived through our constitutional negotiations. I don't know that I would start there. But yes, I mean, I think that the cities play such an important role. And, when the Constitution was created and, historically, it's just they've evolved and people have moved to cities and we need better public transit. So making sure that there is the opportunity for those investments. I mean, I have seen cities have stepped up with working with provinces, and in certain provinces, municipalities, the investments that are going to be made locally in public transit is huge, and the desire is huge, even including for more money from the federal government. So that would be, when you look at the focus in Toronto on major public transit expansions. You see the same thing in Vancouver, which I think is great. Same thing in Montreal, Edmonton, Calgary. And so I think that there's a lot of ambition there, but you're right, we need to be there. We also need to be there with consistent funding. So longer term, that's why going back to one of the campaign commitments was this long-term commitment to public transit in perpetuity. So a $3 billion fund, which actually goes quite a long way because these are very long projects. So you can use that money to support a whole range of different initiatives in whether it's Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, or other places. But I hear you. I hear that it is hard. And I spent a lot of time talking to mayors, big city mayors, mayors of small towns, and also getting more alignment with provinces, because some provinces have a different vision. And I think public transit is it is getting, how do you get people around faster, cheaper, cleaner ways? And so we're a big supporter, and we're going to continue to be investing, but also look at also creative ways to invest, because REM is an example. They did bring in the Canada Infrastructure Bank as a partner. So I think there's also other ways that we can get other dollars involved. But you're right, it can be challenging. Revenue generating can be having toll roads is, I hear you, it's not that easy. But we just need to figure out ways that we are making these investments. Public transit, for some people, it's the only way they can get around, right? So it's an equity issue.
Yeah.
That people don't have access to cars. It also is how you build the communities you want, where they're sustainable. And so anyway, top priority, we're going to continue having those discussions and continuing making the investments.
Well, and on your point, it's not, we often talk about transit as some people have no other option. Great. But it's not just the poor who need transit. No. It's that the middle class would use more transit because, as I said this morning, people will pay to get time back in their life, right? Congestion is evil. It takes away from our lives in the way that we can never get back. So your point's entirely apropos, and you alluded to the REM and innovative financing. So I'm going to stay on the rail theme. We've got a couple questions here about, it's a bit out of your bailiwick, but perhaps we can ask you to provide us with insight into whether the Ministry of Infrastructure is looking at this post-COVID opportunity as an open door for the big kind of projects that Canada needs that are hard to get kind of consensus around in normal times, but maybe now is the time to start doing it. One of them being rail, high frequency rail, high speed rail, and then also just more integrated rail so that there's less trucking freight on the roads and more rail movement of freight goods into cities to reduce emissions. So rail as a mover of people and freight, and is COVID giving us the opportunity to have those grand dialogues in Canada?
So, I mean, I think you always have to think big, whether you're in COVID or not, but you're right, to the extent that there is stimulus dollars, we need to, be thinking about what are the big things that we can do. So in my mandate letter, as well as the Minister of Transportation, there is the high frequency rail in the corridor. And that has been a project that has been discussed for so long. And the Infrastructure Bank is now working with my department, with transport, and they're going to come back to us. But I think that's an example of a project that is overdue, and we owe it to Canadians to figure it out. It'll make a huge difference to improving the lives of folks, but also communities along the line. And I think there's huge opportunities with rail. And this is why, though, you need to have, in some ways, like this long-term view, because all of these projects can be less than the sum of their parts, or they can be greater than the sum of their parts. And so integrating and having a vision of public transit and transportation generally is so important, because that's how you're going to really get the outcomes, and you're going to have a coherent system. We can't be not continuously, but there are, when you have ebbs and flows of infrastructure dollars, and if you don't have a clear vision, you're just going to have projects, and we need to link all of these. And to your point, I think you made a very good point, that public transit should be for everyone. Of course, there's an equity issue, but there's also, we want everyone to take it. It should be an irresistible option, but it has to be irresistible. That means it has to be easy to get to. It needs to go to communities so that it makes sense for them to get out of their car. And it by definition often is faster, but you need to show all those things if you really want to get people on the public transit, so that they say, I'm not going to take my car, or maybe I don't even need a car.
And on that point, it came out of a session we had this morning with Polly Hansen from the American Public Transit Association. She served in a lot of roles as chief of police for transit systems. And one of the things that came out of it in our dialogue about COVID and climate emergency is we thought about transit systems usually as moving people, and that's what they do, and it needs to be faster and more convenient, et cetera, et cetera. But in the COVID world and in emergency response worlds, transit can also be infrastructure that does other important social goods. Like, for example, in the United States, some of the buses, they have Wi-Fi. So they showed up and they realized that kids don't have Wi-Fi at home during COVID, some of the university students, so they let their buses be used for mobile Wi-Fi centers. And we can think of in COVID using buses as mobile vaccination and mobile testing units in communities that are difficult to access for healthcare. So there's actually other ways to redeploy transit. Is there thinking more broadly at infrastructure about the climate resiliency, the catastrophe resiliency, the terrorist attack resiliency of our transit systems as part of your infrastructure mandate? I know it's not explicitly in your mandate.
I think that's a big one. So look, we have a climate lens on our infrastructure. So clearly making sure that you both are reducing emissions and you're adapting to the impacts of climate change. We can't be building things as if climate change doesn't exist. I mean, one of the things that one has to be very aware of, that these are run municipally, and provinces have a role to play. We're not running the public transit system. So, I mean, some of those reflections and some of the innovation is going to come at the municipal level. Like, those are great ideas, that you would redeploy your buses to, help with whatever it is, mobile vaccinations, or that you would use them as a hub for internet. And really, municipalities are probably way better placed than us at the federal level to really understand, what are the opportunities. And we can't micromanage. We really wouldn't have the capacity to do that. Actually, I have quite a small department. But I don't know that actually makes sense. There's a jurisdictional issue, but I just don't know that we do have to have the right incentives and design the right programs. But then we need to have municipalities, that step up and think about a lot of those things, and also the innovation piece, because I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, so organically from bottom up, the city's got to come up with the ideas, and then we have a federal partner willing to help fund and steer that ship. Can I then shift in the final moments that
I have to leave soon, because I actually have a cabinet to go to. So the Prime Minister, I don't want to lose my job. That would be very
fair enough.
Advanced infrastructure investments.
So can we ask you on the final question, area that you have extreme expertise in, carbon pricing? Not all jurisdictions in Canada still have it equivalently, varying political commitments to the concept, but boy, in a post-COVID-19 world, wouldn't it be great to have carbon pricing coming into your coffers? To the extent that you now are in your role as infrastructure and communities, how much do you see carbon pricing still being a challenge ahead to get it at the levels needed in Canada, across Canada? And to what extent can it become a revenue savior for transit systems in the future?
Well, I mean, those are two good questions. I mean, look, we're committed to carbon pricing. The price went up, and there is a price across every single province. And that has to be part of the solution. It's not the only solution to climate change, but it creates the incentive to reduce emissions, because you save money. It's a market mechanism. That's the whole point of it. It's not punitive in the sense that you can save money. And the way we've designed it, so it's not, and I was very involved with this, it is not designed to make the federal government money. That was really important. We have designed it in a way that the revenues go back to people, that you have an incentive on the front end to reduce your emissions, because you'll save money, but you get money back. And that was a design decision, because it makes it so I think that the Canadians see we're not trying to make money off this. We're trying to create incentives for behavioral change. So I don't think it's going to be a revenue generator for folks. So sadly, that is not how we designed it. But, I think there are many other opportunities that we are already using to invest in public transit. We've already invested $13.5 billion. I think 1,500 projects that are making a real difference. And we're going to continue to do that. And we're going to rely on expertise from organizations like CUTRIC and for all the players, because I think this is where trying to get all these links, it sounds easy, but trying to figure out, okay, how do you make sure the supply chain, we're using Canadian companies? How do you make sure you've got the innovation? How do you make sure that you're getting the broader outcomes that you might want to see in terms of local jobs, but also equity? These are complicated issues, but I think we all owe it to Canadians. We're investing money, that tax dollars, but we also are committed to improving outcomes and improving people's lives through public transit. And so we're all going to have to continue working together. And I think people have really seen how critical public transit is now during COVID. And then I think there are some reflections, like we're going to have to figure out, before we have a vaccine, how are we getting people to feel comfortable in public transit? How are we doing it in a safe way? And all of those reflections. But I feel like we're in a good place because we have lots of smart people out there, including, I'm sure, all the folks that are tuning in have an interest in making public transit even better in Canada and having that longer term vision.
Well, and on that point, thank you so much, Minister McKenna, for your time, for your insights. Apologies to your federal cabinet colleagues for making you late.
I won't be late. Don't worry, I can't be late. So I'll turn off now and then rush. But thanks very much, Josepha.
Thanks very much for your leadership. Take care and stay safe.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.